Hello all, welcome to the video Introduction to SQL Constraints from SQL Server eTraining.com. My name is Satish. As part of today's agenda, we will talk about what are constraints and what are the uses of constraints and what are the different types of constraints available in SQL Server. And at the end of the video, we will see how to create, alter and drop a constraint. So let's get started. So what are constraints? Constraints are the rules that we set on a column or a table to restrict the values that are being inserted into the table. That means if we take an example of a Gmail application, if a user is trying to sign up for a Gmail account, he needs to provide all his first name, last name, user ID and password. And let's say he has to provide date of birth also. So date of birth or let's say age. So if he is trying to enter his age as 140 or 200, so that value is not correct. So if you want to store that value in a table in a database, that's something wrong. That means you are storing some incorrect value or the value which does not make any meaning. Okay, so for that reason you will have to restrict this kind of values when you are inserting into the table. So for that reason you use constraints to make this restriction. So what are the uses of constraints? Uses of constraints are it maintains the data integrity. Data integrity means the quality of the data. So whatever the data you want to store in a database, you have to maintain the quality. That means all the type of the data, all the format, what is the format and what are the values. So all this you need to take into consideration before storing it into your database. So you have to design your database in such a way that it handles or it stores the data which has some meaning towards it or which will be useful for your application. Alright, so the use of constraint is to maintain data integrity. Okay, so let's see what are the types of constraints available in SQL Server. We have null and not null, primary key constraint, foreign key constraint, check constraint, default constraint and unique key constraint. Let's talk about one by one and we will try to take an example and then we will see how that constraint works. So the very first type of constraint is null and not null constraint. So what are these constraints? So null and not null are the constraints that will be used to allow nulls or it will not allow null. That means if you create this type of constraint on a column, let's say last name, if you create it as allow nulls, so that column will allow null. So what is a null? Null means the information is not been entered. That means it's unknown. So if from application if you did not enter some information, so how do you represent that unknown information in a table? So you will represent it by using a null value. Okay, so that means whenever you see a null value in a table, you can say that information has not been provided or it's unknown. Okay, so whenever you create a null constraint on a column saying null, that column will allow null. If you just say not null, that column will not allow any nulls. That means you have to provide information in that particular column. Let's take an example. Let's try to create a quick table called customers, and let's say company customers. Okay, I already have customers table in my database, so I just created with a new name. Let's say customer first name, and then the data type is, let's say, varchar 100 and then null. That means that column will allow null values. So the user have an option of entering values or entering some data into this field. Okay, so that's my first column, and then let's say customer last name and then varchar 100, let's say not null. That means the user has to provide last name, mandatory. Okay, so if you try to create that particular table against a database, says the command completed successfully. Now if we try to insert data into that table, and let's say give the column list, and then if you are trying to provide the information for both the columns, okay, so if you try to insert that record, it executes successfully. But then if you try to ignore the column for customer first name, sorry, ignore the value for customer first name, so the value you are entering is only the last name, so you are not providing any value for the column first name. So, and then that first name column will allow nulls. That means you have an option to ignore that column while entering the information. So if you just run that query, it still says one record got affected because that first name column will allow nulls. Okay, so if you look at the data in the table, that was the first record we inserted with both first name and last name entered, and then in the second record you see the first name as null. That means that information we did not provide it in our insert statement. Okay, so that's the reason it took it as null, and the last name it took it as dland. So if we try to insert the same information again, but for this time let's say we are trying to insert only the customer first name as, let's say, Robert, and then if we try to run that query, it gives you an error saying cannot insert the value null into column customer last name, because when we created the table structure we have provided a constraint to last name column saying it should not allow any nulls. Okay, that means you have to provide some information into that particular column when you are inserting. So you may provide dland 1 or something. Okay, so now if you try to run that query, it says we did not give the column name. So let's try to give the column name, and then if you try to run that, it says one record got affected, and then if you look at the data, the third record it says Robert and dland. Okay, so for whichever columns you provide it as null, that means it will allow nulls. That means if there's an option to ignore that column while inserting the data. But if you provide not null, that means you have to provide data value into that particular column. So that is the not null and null constraints. Let's see what is primary key constraint. Primary key constraint is a constraint that enforces unique values in a column. Whenever you try to create a primary key on a particular column, all the values in that column should be unique or distinct. That means no two values in that column will be the same. For example, if we take the same Gmail application and then we have a table called customers table, and then we have first name, last name and user ID. Okay, so every customer or every user should have a different or distinct user ID. No two customers can have same Gmail user ID, right? So you can create a primary key constraint on that particular user ID column of customers table, and then you can enforce that constraint. So primary key constraint is nothing but it will impose a constraint on a column by having only distinct values. It will not allow any duplicate values. Let's take an example. I'm trying to drop the table, and then let's create it again. I'll just copy the same information or the same structure. So my third column is customer user ID, and then I want to put it as varchar 100, and then I want to say primary key. That means a primary key constraint will be created on that user ID column, because if you don't have that primary key constraint, okay, let's not have it, and then we will try to insert the data into the table. So I want to insert Robert's information and then his user ID as robert123@gmail.com. Okay, so if I insert this particular data, it says one record got successful, and then if you try to insert, let's say same Robert with a different last name, Robert David, okay, and then he wants to use same Gmail ID. Okay, so if we try to insert the data into that table, it says one record got affected. Okay, so if you look at the data in the table, so the user ID column, it says the user ID is same for two customers, which is wrong. Okay, so you have to create a constraint on the user ID column. Okay, so that way you can maintain the distinct values in that particular column. Okay, so let's try to create the primary key constraint on that table. I'll also try to explain you how to create a constraint on an existing table and also on a new table. Okay, so for now let's see how to create a constraint when you are creating the structure of the table. So all I have to provide is primary key. Okay, so that says the customer user ID column is a primary key column. That means all the values in that particular column will have distinct values. and that primary key will allow you to identify each record in a column. Okay, because if you take a look at the customers table that we had, actually I dropped it. So the user ID, if we have different user IDs in that particular table, so by looking at each user ID you can get his customer details or his details. Okay, so each user ID will identify each particular record uniquely. So that is the main property of the primary key. And then no value in that particular column, in the primary key column, will allow nulls. That means a user ID cannot be null. Every customer should have some kind of user ID, but it cannot be null. So for that reason, customer user ID, the property for null or not null is not null. That means we cannot allow nulls into primary key column. Okay, so if we try to create that table, and then if we try to insert Robert Delan and his Gmail ID as robert123gmail@gmail.com, and then if we execute that, it says successful. And then if you are trying to insert same user ID for Robert David, it says violation of primary key constraint. That's the constraint name. And then cannot insert duplicate key in that particular table. So that's the duplicate value. That means we have created a constraint successfully, which is not allowing any duplicates into that user ID column. Alright, so that is the main property of primary key constraint. It will identify each row uniquely in a table, will not allow any nulls. Alright, so let's see what is a foreign key constraint. A foreign key constraint will work with the primary key constraint to maintain a relationship between the tables. So we'll take an example. So here we have the customers table, company customers, and then let's try to create company address table. And then let's say address line, and then varchar 100 city varchar 100, and then customer user ID varchar 100. Okay, so we have the customers table, we have the customer first name, last name, and user ID. So using that user ID, I want to have, or I want to create another table and then make these company customers and address in relationship. Okay, by using that customer ID column. So if I try to create that company address table, okay, I forgot to put the comma. So if I try to create it, it says it got successful. And then if I'm trying to insert into company address, and then the values I want to provide, let's say legacy drive and Plano, and then this address is for robert123@gmail.com. okay, so if I try to insert that particular record, it says it's completed. And then if I'm trying to insert another address information, let's say legacy drive 123 and then Dallas, David. Okay, so I have a second record into address table. Now if I look at the data in both my tables, in these two tables, by looking at this data, you can say the customer Robert, his first name is Robert, last name as Delan, and then user ID as robert123@gmail.com. And then by using this user ID, you can look at the address table and then say his address is Legacy Drive, Plano. If you have a second address which says the address line is Legacy Drive 123 Dallas and then david123@gmail.com, but then you don't have this customer in the customers table. Okay, so if you don't have a customer and then you don't know who this address refers to, why do you need that record? That record doesn't make any sense. Okay, so you need to have only those address for only those customers which are existing in your customer table. That means you want to store only the addresses of your company's customers. You do not want to store everyone else's address, right? So for that particular constraint, or to restrict that kind of data, you have to use a foreign key constraint. Okay, so that foreign key constraint will restrict the data in the address table, okay, in such a way that only if the customer exists in the customer table, only then it will allow to create a address in the address table. Okay, so let's try to create that foreign key constraint. So I'll just drop the table. And then when I'm trying to create a foreign key on customer user ID column, all I have to say is provide the foreign key command, and so to which table you are making or having relationship with this table. So with the customers table. So provide the customers table. That's the table name. Okay, sorry. So that's you are creating a foreign key on customer user ID column, and then it references company customers table. Okay, and then which column in that particular table? Customer user ID. Okay, so that's how you give the foreign key constraint. So you are creating a foreign key constraint on customer user ID of address table, and then that value has to be in the customers table of customer user ID column. Okay, so if you are trying to insert a record in address table, so that user ID should be existing in the customer table. Okay, so let's try to create this table. Say successful, and then if we try to insert the address for Robert, let's say Legacy Drive and then Plano and then robert123@gmail.com. If we try to insert the data into that table, it says successful because this user ID exists in this customer table. Okay, so if I try to insert another record for David, who is not our customer, and then if we try to insert that data into address table, it says the insert statement conflicted with the foreign key because this customer does not exist in the customer table. How did we maintain that, or how did we have that constraint? By creating a foreign key constraint. Okay, so that foreign key constraint will allow or will put company address and customers table in relationship. Okay, and then once you have this foreign key relationship between these two tables, address customers table and address table, you cannot delete the data from the customers table because that customer is being referenced in another table. Okay, so let's see. So right now we have the customer Robert Deland. okay, and then his address is in the address table. So if we try to remove this customer, it will throw you an error saying it is being referenced by another table. That means this customer information is being used by address table. Okay, so for that reason it will not allow to remove the data from customers table. Okay, so first you have to remove that data from address table, and only then you can delete the data from customer table. Okay, so foreign key constraint will maintain the relationship between tables. Okay, so let's see what is check constraint. Check constraint means nothing but the values which are being entered into the table will have to pass a rule that we created as a check constraint. Okay, so for example, let's say if someone is trying to enter a value 140 or let's say 150 as his age. Okay, so that value needs to be stored in age column in customers table. So that age value, if it doesn't look good, okay, so you will try to create a rule saying that age needs to be between 18 and let's say 100. Okay, let's say 110. Okay, so that's the 110 is the maximum age we may know of a person existing in this world. Okay, so let's say 110. So all your customers information, whoever is entering his age, it needs to be between 18 and 110. If anything other than between 18 and 110, it should fail. That means you are not supposed to store that value. Okay, so for that you have to create a check constraint. So how do we create that? So check constraint will restrict depending upon the business rule. Okay, so now if I try to create a company address or let's say company customers, see it says I cannot drop the company's customer table because it is being referenced by address table. Okay, so I have to drop the company address table first, and then I can drop the company customers table. Okay, so now I'll try to create the table again with a let's say age column and then integer and then not null, because we have to store his age information. Okay, so now if I try to create that table and then insert data into that table, okay, it says cannot insert null value into the age. We have to provide the age, let's say 140. Okay, now if we try to insert this record, it inserts successfully. But if we try to create a constraint on this table, on the same table, let's say check, so what rule you want to check? Age should be greater than 18 or equal to 18 and age less than or equal to 110. Okay, so that's your business rule. So if you try to create the table again and then if you try to insert this record, it says the insert statement conflicted with the check constraint. Okay, that means you cannot provide value which is less than or equal to less than 18 and more than 110. Okay, so if you just say 80, it will take it successfully. Okay, so it says one record got inserted. So that's how you create a check constraint on a table to restrict the values that are being inserted into the table. So you can create or you can use any function to have a check constraint. Okay, so you can have all your business logic in that function, and then you can use that function as a in the check constraint. Okay, so every value that will be entering into the table, that value should be checked against that particular function. Okay, so that's only for this column. Okay, so that's all about check constraint. So what is the default constraint? Default constraint will allow default values when no value is entered into the table. Let's say and then if we have some create date. So if you want to store the create date information, okay, so whenever the data got inserted into this table, you want to store that date and time. So create date, data type of date and time, and then let's say not null, and then you want to put the default as get date. Get date is a function used to get the date and time of that particular day, okay, or that particular point of time. Whenever an insert happens, it will get that date and time and then it will store it in the table. So let's say select get date and then it will give you today's date and time. Okay, so if you create that table and then if you are trying to insert the data into table and then the default value, it says not null. Okay, so even if you do not provide any information in that particular column, a default value will be taken from the default constraint. Okay, so if you try to insert that record, the Roberts information into company customers and then execute it, it says one record got affected. So even if it's not null, we did not provide any value. Okay, so if we don't have a default and then if it has a not null and then if we do not provide any value, it will throw you an error. Okay, because it has a default as get date, it did not throw you any error. So if you look at the data in the table, it says that 2013-07-13. Okay, so that's the date and time it took it. So that's the default constraint. So you can create default constraint on any of your columns. So default constraint when created will take default values. And then what are unique constraints? Unique constraint is nothing but same as the primary key constraint. Okay, it's not same, it's similar. Okay, so unique constraint when created on a column will that all the values in that particular column will be distinct. That means should be distinct. No duplicate values are allowed in the unique key column. Okay, so the same property exists for the primary key also. So all the values in a primary key column or the column which you create primary key, okay, so that column values are always distinct. No duplicate data will be allowed in that particular column. So the only difference between primary key and unique key is that the primary key column will not allow any nulls, not even single null, but then unique key column or the column on which you create unique key constraint, it will allow only one null. Okay, so that's the difference. So all the values are distinct and only one null is allowed. So here in primary key constraint we have seen that no nulls are allowed. In unique key we allow only one null. So that's how you create constraints while creating the table structure. What if you have already created a table structure and then in future if you want to create constraints on the table, so how do you do that? So we can use alter command to create constraints. Okay, so let's see how do we create all these constraints by using alter command. So I'll just try to drop that table and then I will have that customer first name, last name, user ID, age and create date, and then I'll try to remove those constraints that we created. Okay, now I have this table. Now I want to create the null constraint. Okay, so let's say customer first name is allowing nulls, okay, by its structure, but then I don't want to allow it. So how do I do that? So just say alter table and then provide the table name. So we are altering that particular column. So alter column and the column name and then the data type, and then let's say not null. So if you execute that, it says command completed successfully. And then if you look at the table in your database, so the customer first name has changed from null to not null. Okay, so let's see how do we create a primary key constraint. So we are altering the same table and then we want to add a constraint, and then we can give the constraint name as pk underscore the constraint name, and then on which column you want to create, let's say customer first name or no user ID. Okay, so this is the name I have given to the constraint, to the primary key constraint. Okay, so you can just give pk underscore primary key or something. Okay, so every company or every organization will have its own naming standards, so you have to follow that naming standards. Okay, so the one which I have given here is most used by all of the users or developers. Okay, because by looking at the name you can say that constraint is a primary key constraint. Okay, so that's pk stands for primary key, and then so that's the table name. So that's the primary key created on that particular table and that particular column. Okay, so you can use any naming standard. So that's add constraint, constraint name, and then the type of constraint, primary key, and then the column name. So customer user ID column. So if you try to alter that, it says command completed successfully, and then if you look at the keys you can see primary key customers has been, that particular constraint has been created. And then if you just refresh the customers and then on the customer user ID you can see that yellow key button which represents that a primary key is created on that particular column. And then you can similarly create a foreign key constraint. So let's try to have that address table, and then let's remove the foreign key constraint. So I've created the company address without any constraint. Now I want to so just refresh tables, and then you can see that new table got created, and then there are no keys or no constraints or you can see the constraints on the constraints folder. Okay, so pull that table name and then add constraint, and then foreign key constraint, the name you can just provide it as fk underscore the table name and then the column name. Okay, and the type of constraint is foreign key, and then references, that's the table it's referencing to, and that's the column. Okay, so here we are trying to alter that address table, and then we are trying to add a constraint for a foreign key. That's the name of the foreign key constraint, and that's the type of constraint. Okay, and then provide the column on which you want to create the foreign key, and then it references the company customers table. Okay, and then that's the column. Alright, so if you try to run that query, you can see command completed successfully, and then if you refresh your table, you can see the foreign key constraint, that's the name we have provided, and then you can see the gray key button, that means or that represents the foreign key constraint has been created on that particular column. Okay, so now let's see how to create a check constraint. So if you want to create a check constraint on the customers table and then on the age column, so add constraint and then provide the constraint name as CK check constraint. Okay, and then that's the table name, and then on the age column, and then the type of constraint check constraint, and the age greater than or equal to 18 and age less than equal to 110. Okay, now if we try to create that particular constraint, it says it's successfully completed, and then if you click your customers table and refresh, and then you can see your constraint has been created on age column. Okay, so that's how you create the check constraint. So how do you create the default constraint? So alter table, and then that's the table name, so add constraint and then df, provide the table name and the default you want to create it on, let's say create date. Okay, and then you are trying to create default constraint. On which column you want to create it? Sorry, let's say what is the default value? Get date for create date. Okay, so that's how you provide the default constraint. So you are creating a default constraint on create date, and the default value will be get date. Okay, so it says command completed successfully, and then if you refresh your constraints, you can see the default constraint. And then the last constraint is the unique constraint. So if you add constraint and then UK, and then let's say unique key and then unique, that's the type of the constraint, and then on which column you want to create, we don't have any column. Okay, which we can create unique key constraint which has meaning, because you cannot create a unique key constraint on last name, because if you create it, it doesn't make any sense, because two persons may have or two customers may have same last name, right? Okay, so if you can create it, but it's not correct. Okay, so for that reason, let's try to add a new column alter table and then add, let's say some id integer and then not null. So I'm trying to create a new column into that table. So if you click their company's customers and then refresh it, I can see a new ID column has been added. Now I can create the unique key constraint on that particular column. Okay, so if you look at the constraints and then refresh it, so you can see the unique key has been created on that particular column. Okay, the ID column. So the unique key, the primary key and the foreign key, you can see it under keys, whereas the constraints you can view it under the constraints folder. Okay, so the only difference between the creating constraints when you are creating the table structure and then doing the alter, okay, the only difference is that you are creating the constraint directly when you are creating the table structure, but in future once you have done your table structure, everything ready, but then in future if you have to create more constraints or if you are trying to create new columns and then you have to change the constraint, or if you want to create a new constraint, then you can use alter and then you can add your constraints. Okay, now what if you want to drop the constraints? All you have to do is just say alter table and then provide the table name and then drop constraint and then give the constraint name. Whatever constraint you want to drop, just provide that constraint and then drop it. Okay, the only thing you have to make sure is you have to drop the foreign key constraint first and then the primary key constraint, because foreign key is referencing the primary key. Okay, so primary key is kind of a parent and then primary key is kind of a parent and foreign key is kind of a child, so you cannot just drop the parent without child element. Okay, so that's all with the constraints. Thank you all for attending this video.